In this episode, we will take a look at what is required for a cut to succeed. The first thing to note is that what is exactly required depends a lot on the target you are cutting. Some targets are easier to cut than others. With some targets, you can compensate for the lack of one or more of the generic requirements with more in one of the others. With some targets, even a very bad cut can succeed, especially if you are using a sword which is very good at compensating for user error. However, we are not here to talk about how bad we can cut and still succeed. We are going to take a look at the aspects of a successful cut, which are dependent on the user. As such, we are not going to talk about the target you are cutting or the sword you are using. We are strictly concentrating on the things in which your skill as a cutter has an impact. Just remember, there are other things which come into play and there are no absolute values for which to aim for. You should strive to be as good as possible in maximizing these values. Now that we have that out of the way, let's take a look at what it actually means to cut. The important distinction here being between cutting and slicing. To cut, we need to direct energy in and through the target. You can think this similar to how you would chop wood or how a butcher would cut through meat and bones. To slice, we push or pull the edge along the surface of the target and apply pressure. You can think something like slicing a tomato or slicing bread. Slicing generally causes superficial wounds. Just like to get through a tomato or a bread, you need to do multiple slicing motions. When chopping wood or cutting through bones with a meat cleaver, you usually want to do that in one go. This means that cutting tends to go deeper. The important distinction to understand here is that to cut we direct energy through a target and to slice we direct energy along the surface of the target. This has a lot to do what people call leading with the tip. This simply means that when you impact on the target, you want to have your sword blade as perpendicular to the cutting arc as possible. Let me explain in a bit more detail. When cutting, you want the cutting motion to be a rotation instead of a linear motion. My cutting series explains this in a more detail, but for now let's just agree that this is what we want. In 2 dimensions, you can imagine this as an arc of a sector of a circle. For a moment, let's imagine a completely vertical cut as seen from the side. The center of rotation is between the shoulders and the sword is coming down along the arc. Now, let's imagine that we hit the target while holding the sword in 2 different ways, in a 90-degree grip and in a handshake grip. Once again, these are explained in more detail in my cutting series. The short explanation is that in a handshake grip, you are trying to extend the sword as far forward as you can without compromising the grip. This basically means that you are trying to have as large of an angle between your forearm and the short edge of the blade. In a 90-degree grip, you hold the sword like a baby holds a spoon, having a 90-degree or close to angle between the sword and your forearm. In the first example, we are holding the sword in the so-called 90-degree grip. The blade will hit the target at a rather large angle and the hands are clearly leading. In the second scenario, the sword is now held in a handshake grip. The sword blade is now closer to perpendicular to the cutting arc. The tip is not literally leading the hand, but the difference is a lot smaller. The sword is also hitting the target at a smaller angle. When cutting, we are pushing the sword against the target. We are also slightly pulling the sword towards us because of the rotational motion. In the 90-degree example, you can see that the sword is already aligned in a way that it is ready to be pulled along the surface of the target. This is what we want to do when we are trying to slice. On the other hand, in the handshake example, you can see that the sword is aligned so that it wants to go through the target instead of along it. You can also test this rather easily. Hold your non-dominant arm in front of you so that it is bent 90 degrees to the side. Now, use your dominant arm to mimic a sword. Place the dominant arm on the one in front of you so that it is angled upwards. Try to move your dominant arm down by rotating from the shoulder. You should notice that it wants to slide along your non-dominant arm. In other words, it slices. Now, do the same but point your dominant arm straight forwards. Again, try to move your dominant arm down by rotating from your shoulder. Now, your arm should not slice. In fact, it shouldn't really move as it can't pass through your non-dominant arm. You can also do the same test by hitting a bell or other stationary object. With this, we should be on the same page about what we are talking about. Now, let's go to take a look at the actual recipe for a successful cut. This is what people are referring to when they talk about tip velocity or tip speed. I specifically use the term speed here, and there are two reasons for it. Firstly, speed is the rate at which an object is traveling along a path. It's a scalar value. Velocity is a vector. This means that velocity has a direction. Speed does not. The direction part comes into play when we talk about trajectory. The reason I'm not using the term tip speed is that we don't actually care about the speed of the tip of the sword. What we care about is the speed of the part of the blade which comes into contact with the target. However, I have nothing against the terms tip speed and tip velocity. It's just that in my opinion, speed is more accurate in this situation. However, tip speed and tip velocity are just good enough when we are actually talking about this. Now that the terminology is out of the way, why do we actually care about the speed that our sword is moving at? This is because to cut through an object we need energy. We can simplify this to kinetic energy. In other words, energy an object has due to its motion. To be more specific, we should actually be talking about rotational kinetic energy, but in my opinion, the simplification to kinetic energy is good enough for our discussion here. When a sharp sword hits a target, we want it to cut into it and continue moving through it. The more kinetic energy the sword has, the more effective it will be in cutting into and through the target. That is given that edge alignment and other such important things are good enough. The more energy we have, the more we can lose before the sword comes to a stop. In other words, stops cutting. In this case, the object is the sword we are swinging. Swinging is the motion, and the energy is what we need to cut. Kinetic energy can be calculated as half of an object's mass multiplied by velocity squared. From this, it is very easy to see that velocity is very important. As I said before, the trajectory is the direction part of the velocity, and we'll be talking about this later. For now, let's just concentrate on the speed or the how fast part of the velocity. Because the velocity is squared, if it doubles, the kinetic energy quadruples. So if we want to hit harder, that being with more energy, we want to concentrate on increasing the speed of our sword, or as people usually put it, the tip velocity or the tip speed. When we strike a target, we need some minimum speed to cut into the target. If the sword is going slower than this, it stops. What this minimum speed is depends on the target. When the sword hits the target will resist the sword's movement through it. In other words, the sword will start to slow down. The more speed we have, the more we can lose before the sword stops inside the target. Our aim is to have enough speed that the sword comes out of the target before the speed drops below the minimum requirement. If we succeed in this, we cut through. If not, the sword gets stuck in the target. Or if we don't have enough speed in the first place, we don't even cut into the target. Now, a high speed can compensate for bad edge alignment and bad trajectory. As we have more energy to spare, we can afford to lose more of it. This is what people are referring to when they talk about muscling through with a cut. They compensate for bad edge alignment and/or trajectory by hitting harder. On the other hand, if our edge alignment and trajectory are good, we don't need as much speed to begin with. Naturally, we want to be as close to perfect as we can in everything to make cutting as effortless as possible. In the previous section, I mentioned that trajectory is the direction part of velocity. I may have simplified things quite a bit. As a big generalization, this is close enough. However, trajectory is not the sword's direction at the specific moment. It is the whole path the sword travels. Just as the speed of the sword changes during different parts of the cut, so does its direction. In effect, you can get the sword's velocity at a specific moment in time by taking its speed and its direction at that point. Or you can get its average velocity by taking the direction from the starting point of the trajectory to the end point of the trajectory and the average speed of the sword during the cut. When we are talking about trajectory, we are talking about the whole path the sword travels during the cut. More specifically, we are interested in the trajectory during the time the sword is in contact with the target. In reality, however, we need to take a look at the trajectory during a larger portion of the cut. It is very unlikely that our trajectory is bad before we make contact with the target and after we make contact with the target, but that it is perfect during the sword is making contact with the target. Then, what is a good trajectory? If we flatten our example to 2 dimensions, a perfect trajectory is a straight line. However, in 3 dimensions, our sword is moving in a rotational motion. That is why in 3 dimensions I like to imagine a perfect trajectory as a plane on which our sword is moving on. In my examples, I'll be simplifying them to 2 dimensions. A curve in 2 dimensions is much more easy to understand than a curved surface in 3 dimensions, and honestly, in our specific case, it doesn't really make any difference. Just think of the 2-dimensional line as the side of our surface in 3 dimensions. As I mentioned, in 2 dimensions a perfect trajectory is straight. If your trajectory is curved, you are not optimally directing energy to cut. We want the sword to move in a single direction, so it can cut effectively. If your trajectory is curved within the target, it will cause the sword to slow down more rapidly. Often this will cause the cut to come to a stop within the target. You can think about it like this. When you hit a target with a sharp sword, firstly the surface is pressed in. Then, if your cut is good enough, eventually the surface will give up and the sword will actually cut into the target. Now, if you are not cutting a hanging target, as the sword moves through the target, the cut will close behind the sword, or at least it will try to. Basically, both sides of the cut will be pressing against the blade. If we turn our blade within the target, the front edge is going to press against the side we are turning towards you. Similarly, the back edge of the sword will be pressing against the side we are turning away from. In effect, we are trying to wedge open the cut. In addition to this, we are changing the direction into which we are directing energy to. This is not as efficient as maintaining the current direction. Curved trajectory also tends to cause edge alignment issues, so let's talk about those next. Edge alignment simply means, is your edge aligned with your trajectory? Your edge should always point exactly to the direction your sword is moving to. As the edge is the only cutting part of the sword, it must point to the direction the sword is moving to. Naturally, if you hit something with the flat of the sword, it's not going to cut. What most people don't understand is that with edged weapons, the error margin for edge alignment is rather small. This becomes especially true when cutting harder and/or denser targets. If your edge alignment is off too much, the sword will simply not cut. It will come to stop on contact. It might give a bruise or a nick, but that is not what we are aiming for. If the edge alignment is a bit better, but still not good, the sword will cut into the target and then stop. It is possible that before the sword hits the target, the edge alignment is spot on, and the sword cuts into the target. However, uneven grip, curved trajectory, and many other things may cause the blade to twist inside the target. This causes the edge to become misaligned with the trajectory, and once again, the sword comes to a stop within the target. Based on the blade geometry, some swords are more forgiving on edge alignment issues than others. This is especially true when it comes to edge alignment changes within the target. Generally speaking, wider, thinner, and stiffer blades are more forgiving with edge alignment. On the other hand, thicker, narrower, and/or more flexible blades tend to be more specific with their edge alignment requirements. The final part of the equation is follow-through. To cut into target, at impact you must have enough speed, good enough edge alignment, and straight enough trajectory. Follow-through is basically the answer to the question, can you maintain those three things through the target? Especially those with lots of drilling and sparring experience may have learned to hit the target, not through the target. This means that they speed up the sword but stop maintaining the speed before impact. From a sparring perspective, this is actually a nice thing. You don't hit as hard, so it's less likely that you are going to hurt your sparring partner. Also, as you are not trying to drive the cut through your target, you have already relaxed your muscles. This makes making follow-up actions that much faster. The bad thing is that with a sharp weapon, this is not effective. At the best case, the sword is just going to cut in and get stuck. More likely, it's going to maybe cause a superficial wound at best, but more likely not even that. You want to keep trying to accelerate the sword until it is through the target. Because the target resists the sword will start to slow down as soon as it comes to contact with the target. Because of this, you need to be able to keep the sword moving fast enough to cut until it is all the way out of the target. In addition to this, I include maintaining good edge alignment and straight trajectory to follow through. And this is the reason why I say that follow through is maintaining speed, edge alignment, and trajectory through the target. The last part of a successful cut is distance, or more specifically, what part of the sword you hit your target with. As explained in the speed section, extension is very important for speed and thus our cutting potential. To maximize extension, we want to have our arm straight and to use a handshake grip to extend the sword properly. Because we always want to maximize extension, distance from our target is the only thing which should affect which part of our sword comes in contact with the target. This is of course presuming that you are close enough to the target to hit it in the first place. Let's start with a bit of a theory recap. As mentioned in the speed section, we are not actually interested in the speed of the tip of the sword. We are actually interested in the speed of the part of the sword which comes in contact with our target. As explained before, we want to cut in a rotational motion. In a rotation, the further a point is from the center of rotation, the longer distance it is going to travel. Speed is distance divided by time. As the rotation takes the same amount of time for all points on the blade, a point further along the blade will move faster. As also explained in the speed section, the faster the sword moves, the better. Based on this basic theory, we can safely say that the closer we cut to the point of the sword, the better. At least when it comes to speed. With this knowledge, you might think that the answer to the question, with what part of the sword should I cut with, would be as close to the tip as possible. Partly that is true, but the important part here is the as possible. Now, I should mention that we are aiming to maximize cutting potential. We are not looking at a specific martial situation. Martially, a very shallow cut with the very tip of the sword might be a very good idea. This is if you can target someone's eyes, throat, or arteries, or some other things such as those. However, we are now looking at a more generic situation in which we are just trying to maximize our cutting potential to go through possibly very resistive or thick materials. Now, the long answer to the question is that you just need to get familiar with your sword. Different swords have a different optimal point to cut with. I'll give you a few quick all-around tips which can get you close enough with unfamiliar swords or sword simulators, and then I'll go a bit more in depth with this question. The first very generic tip would be to cut roughly 1/3 of the blade down from the tip. With this you can get pretty good results with almost any sword. This is also what I recommend when using sparring weapons and other training tools. If you are at a cutting party and are handed a sword and told to cut, 1/3 down the blade will do just fine. The next answer is to cut where the blade or the forward vibration node is. You can find it easily by loosely holding the sword in your hand and hitting the pommel with your other hand. The vibration node is where the blade seems to stay still. This is important because at that specific point the blade will be stiff on impact. Everywhere else it will flex. This means that if you cut at the vibration node, the blade will not flex as much in the target, thus making cutting easier. There is a rather interesting segment on Peter Johnson's talk on the subject in YouTube. The link is in the description and I recommend you go and take a look. As you saw, this is rather easy to do, so I would recommend that you do it if you are unfamiliar with the sword you are using. Now we get to the know your sword part of this question. Some swords are more forgiving when cutting outside the vibration node, especially when cutting closer to the tip. Generally, I would not recommend cutting closer to the hilt unless martially absolutely necessary. In this case, we are only going to take a look at cutting closer to the tip. That way we can both maximize the speed and stay further away from our target. The wider and thinner the blade is near the tip, the better it generally will cut there. Swords like this, which are also very flexible, tend to be extremely picky about the edge alignment. If the edge alignment is spot on, they will cut extremely well. If not, they might not just cut at all. The best kinds of swords for cutting near the tip are thin, wide, and stiff. Example of swords like these are the 18C type swords, which can be seen very often in cutting competitions. In general, these types of swords tend to be extremely good cutters. Now, swords which do not tend to cut well near the tip are those with narrow blades, especially swords which have a blade which narrows to a very fine point. If a blade is both thick and narrow near the tip, it tends not to cut that well there. It can still cut, but you will have to compensate a lot with skill and power generation. If the blade is thin and narrow, it tends to cut a bit better. However, you really have to get the edge alignment near perfect. If your edge alignment is not spot on, those kinds of blades tend to be quite underperforming as cutters. Now, these are only general tendencies based on blade geometry. In truth, you just have to get to know your sword or swords and see how much cutting with different parts of the blade affects performance. Before we get into the recap, go and tap the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, remember to click the bell icon so you get notified when high quality content like this gets online. To perform a successful cut, you want to hold the sword in such a way that you can lead with the tip. In other words, you want to have a handshake hold so you can maximize the angle between your forearm and the short edge of the sword. You want to maximize your tip speed to have enough energy to cut into the target. Your trajectory must be straight so you can direct the energy of the cut into a single direction. Your edge must be aligned with your trajectory as the edge is the only cutting part of the sword. Hitting people with the flat is less than optimal. To get the sword through the target instead of just into the target, you must have a proper follow-through. In other words, you must be able to maintain enough speed, good enough edge alignment, and a straight enough trajectory all the way through the target. When in doubt, cut 1/3 down the blade. If you have time, find the blade vibration node and cut with that part of the blade.